To the Moon is one of my favorite stories of all time. Ever since I watched Markiplier play it back in the day, it has permanently ingrained itself in my memory as an extremely well-told story, in addition to being a just beautiful one by itself. Obviously, I'm gonna have to spoil it, but given that a lot of this game is a mystery, that does fundamentally ruin a large part of what makes this game great. So please, I cannot recommend it enough, please go check out the original. So if you're still here, I think it's safe to assume that you have already experienced the game in full and are not in need of a recap. If you're one of those who just watch game essays without ever playing first, then fair enough, same, but I'm going to skip the premise for a minute and instead just cover the lives of our two protagonists. Again, spoiler warning, please go check out the original. Our first main character is named John, who importantly had a twin brother named Joey. Their mother strongly favored Joey, not exactly abusing John, but still very clearly having a favorite. John also had a bit of an identity crisis, wanting to stand out more and be unique. This probably had something to do with his twin status, though I can't really say too much more confidently, I'm not an expert. Meanwhile, there was River. She was extremely knowledgeable, a little weird, and very worried about how other people might think of her. Importantly, she has Asperger's, so not that many friends and some difficulty socializing, most likely at least. The two of them met alone at a cliffside outside the town fair. There, the two of them had an extremely wholesome moment stargazing. River confessed a very unique way of viewing each of the stars. Specifically, that each one is a lighthouse, that they're all separated distantly across the universe, and that each one of them is lonely, that they're all deeply wanting connections. She also makes the point that the moon, alongside the stars, forms a constellation of a large rabbit. This does come back again later. Beyond that, the two of them bond over the names, John and River, which both of them actively hate, albeit for very different reasons. In John's case, he highlights the fact that he does want a more interesting name, whereas River, who has an interesting name, would rather not. Which makes sense because she is somewhat insecure about the fact she's different than everyone else. In other words, both wanting what the other has. John ultimately has to go, but before he does, he gives her the items he won at the fair. She had mentioned earlier that she couldn't quite win them on her own. The two of them agreed to meet up 1 year later, but failing that, if either of them couldn't make it or forgot, then they agreed to meet up on the moon, which is a little bit arbitrary, but fair enough, it works and it's really cinematic, it's nice. To him, it was probably not a big deal. It was a pleasant conversation and something he would remember, but maybe not a major character moment. To her, though, it likely meant a lot. She had confessed her way of seeing the stars and her life dream of befriending a lighthouse, and she had done this to someone she barely knows. Given that she cares about how other people think of her, and just how much it ties into her insecurities, like the concept of loneliness between both her and the lighthouses, and the fact that she likely doesn't have much experience socializing, and so she probably doesn't have experience being vulnerable with that many people, and then cap it all off with the fact that she's being given two gifts that she wouldn't have been able to get otherwise, it's very likely this whole experience meant quite a bit to her. She had possibly just made her very first friend who agreed to meet up with her 1 year later. And failing that, to meet up on the moon. Soon after, John's brother died. The mother was driving and there was an accident. Her favorite son died because of her. John was put in a massive amount of mind-altering medications, seemingly for the purpose of trying to get him to forget about the brother dying, and it succeeded. He forgot his brother existed altogether. He unfortunately, but understandably, forgot his cliffside rendezvous because of this, meaning once again that River ended up alone. At some point in the aftermath of the accident, John's mother starts calling him by his dead brother's name, Joey. If he wasn't insecure about his identity beforehand, this is probably where it started. So fast forward years later, the two of them are in high school. John has a best friend now, Nicholas, who he shares many great experiences with, and River has no one, she's still alone. She never brought up the promise John made to her all those years before. John develops a bit of a crush on River, although he doesn't know her very well. She's portrayed in his high school memories as being extremely knowledgeable, but not really understanding social cues. She takes forever to respond when given questions by teachers, but once she does, she keeps talking and talking and talking, and she clearly doesn't seem to pick up the social etiquette around when to start and finish sentences. She still seems to lack friends, as evidenced by her sitting alone at lunch. John mentions to Nicholas that part of the reason why he's interested in her is that he wants to become a more unique and interesting person, and he feels like dating her would help him get that. Nicholas responds with disappointment, because you shouldn't want someone for what they have, you should want them for their personality, you should want them for themselves. I feel weird about this. It's one of the few conversations in the game I don't like, since it doesn't feel like conversations actual high schoolers might have. But aside from that, the idea is presented. He wants her for less than ideal reasons. One day, with Nick's support, John asks her out, and he's ungodly nervous. River, seeing the friend who abandoned her finally speaking to her again all these years later without explanation, is justifiably terrified. The fact that she still has the platypus as a high schooler, and that she seemingly carries it around with her everywhere, means that it was extremely important to her, that conversation by the cliffside. It also highlights just how socially awkward she is, and so for all those reasons, it's very unlikely that she isn't completely terrified with him asking her out. Endearingly wholesome and awkward conversation aside, they end up agreeing to go to a movie. Misunderstanding how dates work, she sits separate from him, but still watching the movie from within the same room. John, thinking he's been stood up, goes outside to wait for her in case she came late. River, meanwhile, realizing something is wrong, runs out to check on him. She actually comes across as somewhat nervous about it, only for him to laugh off the situation, finding it super wholesome and endearing because, again, he likes her because she's interesting. The date goes well, and they stay together. She never asks him why he left her and why he never came back to the cliffside. She's grateful for the friendship she has, and she doesn't want to risk it. Some years later, she gets officially diagnosed with autism as an adult. Asked whether the relationship has any issues, River immediately says it doesn't, while it takes a moment for John to agree that there aren't any actual problems. John just generally doesn't seem to know how to respond to the diagnosis. Maybe it's guilt from his original motivations for going out with her, maybe it's fear that her interesting character traits could lose their magic and that he might lose interest in her. Maybe he's just lazy and not wanting to put in the effort to actually try and understand her condition. And if so, maybe he even feels guilty about that much. The idea that all her little quirks that he's been laughing at are actually signs of a serious condition is probably a lot to take in. Regardless, he declines the book on autism recommended by the doctor to try and help understand her condition, and in doing so kind of implies that he doesn't actually care. While it isn't exactly established that she does interpret it that way, the possibility itself still feels noteworthy. It's something that might eat away at her in the background. Some years later, the two of them end up married, and John's mother notably still calls him Joey even on his wedding day. It's a very small detail, but River noticeably has her eyes shift towards John as he's talking about it. The implication is that she doesn't really know why herself, and that she presumably has not brought it up to him. Even with them getting married, she might still be nervous about damaging their relationship. Years later, John is speaking to Nick and his wife Isabelle, an actress who also has Asperger's. River's communication issues have been getting to him, and he's hoping they can somehow help him. Isabelle explains that River doesn't necessarily want to be aloof or different, that she still wants connection even if she isn't very good at expressing it. Beyond that, though, Isabelle expresses envy towards River, that she is unabashedly herself, whereas Isabelle has been acting normal for so long that she doesn't really know her true self anymore. River and John speak shortly afterwards about children's books, and how it's fine to like them as an adult still, even if it's for different reasons. In her words, they're comforting. She buys a book, The Emperor's New Clothes, one of the only named books in the library at the modern day. We might come back to this later. Soon after, John explains why he was originally interested back in high school. He confesses wanting to be more interesting and using her as an avenue to achieve that. Far from being angry, I suspect she was, if anything, relieved to hear it. He mentions a few scenes later that she and him talked a lot more after this confession, with her being far more comfortable around him. She obviously cared about him and their relationship for a very long time, but if I'm reading it correctly, she had been insecure about her condition and her being weird the entirety of it. For her to find out simultaneously that her fears and insecurities are not justified, and that he does actually sincerely love her weird, quirky personality, it would be insanely validating. There were multiple points in the early relationship where she seemed worried about scaring him off and losing him again. Her decision to not ask about him abandoning her at the cliffside, or to not ask about the brother Joey, both reinforce this. She's been terrified of losing him. But aside from these positive aspects, it does raise a question. He referenced the high school encounter as being their first meeting, and not the cliffside. Realizing he doesn't remember, she tries to jog his memory by leaving origami rabbits around their home. The rabbits each being a callback to the moon constellation they made back when they were at the cliff. He never ends up getting it, and she never explains. She just keeps making more and more rabbits, hoping that eventually it'll somehow get through to him. Finding out that their personal lighthouse, the one they got married at, was being abandoned, they decide to build a home near it so that they could visit it every day. They end up naming the lighthouse Anya. While John doesn't remember at all, River is actually living her childhood dream. She's befriending a lonely lighthouse, who, just like her, didn't have any friends. Years later, as the house is getting built, John and Nick speak again. The relationship is going better than ever, and they're actually communicating now, the only thing being that she's still obsessively making these rabbits over and over. Years later still, River is sick. John doesn't have the money to pay for both her treatment and building the house, and worried about which one she would choose, he lies to her about it. Sensing that he's lying, she denies treatment. Even now, all these years later, it is extremely important to her to befriend a lonely lighthouse. Eventually she dies. John mourns the loss, but carries on her wish of visiting the lighthouse every day. Approaching his own death, he reaches out to Sigmund Corp, hoping to have his dying wish granted, to, for reasons he doesn't understand, go to the moon. To, without his realizing, be with River. Cut to the player characters. You play the game as Dr. Watts and Dr. Rosalind, who together travel back through his memories to implant his younger self with his dying wish, re-simulating his life with the constant and unending goal of achieving his dreams since day one. You allow him to relive his entire life with the sole purpose of getting to the moon, having all of his decisions and the memories of the decisions be whatever gets him towards that goal. By the end of the game, you succeed, but at a cost. Watts and Rosalind fight about it, but River has to be removed from John's memory in order for him to actually want to meet up with her again on the moon. She's only gone temporarily because her life was also dedicated to the same task. Through random chance, they both dedicated their lives to joining NASA. Rosalind guessed correctly that she was so important to John that he would somehow subconsciously bring her back. That he, on some level, could not imagine life without her, and that he had no doubt in his mind she would also try to meet up with him at the moon, and that she was so smart and capable she would eventually make it. And so ends the recap. Assuming the message of the game is whatever the characters should have learned from their experiences, whatever would have allowed them to avoid their issues, which the audience can then take and use in their own personal life, then there is a general theme of trust and communication that is very strong throughout the game. In John's case, his failure to trust River with the actual motivations for him originally liking her both led to him feeling guilty for a very long time, and her feeling insecure for just as long. She might not have cared as much about him forgetting their first encounter if he hadn't waited so long to bring it up, meaning the decision to make origami rabbits might have been avoided. Similarly, his failure to trust her regarding the finances of the house and her treatment might be a large part of why she chose to refuse the treatment outright. She might have been open for discussion if he hadn't tried to trick her. So he should have trusted her and communicated with her more effectively, and that would have potentially avoided most of those issues. In River's case, it's a bit more complicated. Isabelle expresses the idea that being good at social skill and being true to yourself are mutually exclusive, that you have to pick one, and I personally disagree with that strongly. While I am qualified to talk about Asperger's representation, I still don't like doing it, so if River decided not to learn to socialize, I'm not going to question it. What I do feel comfortable critiquing, however, is the decision to make the rabbits. While it does work very well narratively, and it does work potentially as a way to try and jog his memory, doing so hundreds of times expecting one of them to work after all of the other attempts failed is kind of insane. Again, I don't really feel comfortable analyzing it from a representation angle, but I can say that he is capable of remembering things from that era. Watts and Rosalind do manage to successfully remind him of the events regarding Joey's death, and I can confidently say they would have been much happier if she hadn't been making them. Her decision to not communicate properly how they first met did ultimately cause both of them a lot of suffering. Beyond that, on the subject of trust, the decision to allow Sigmund Corp to alter his memories does allow him to spend a lifetime with River. He does get to go to the moon. Rosalind decides to put her faith in John that River will somehow find a way back into his life, and it pays off in much the same fashion. So, the main theme of the game is communicating your true self to other people, trusting them with important information, like letting them know what you're really like on the inside. Almost. This doesn't actually acknowledge the identity-based themes that both John and River's characters are built around, nor the identity-based commentary that Isabelle provides, but to be completely fair, I'm not going to analyze that either. I'll leave that set of ideas for someone else to explore, since my interests lie elsewhere. Specifically, I'm interested in the Emperor's New Clothes, and the conversation in the library. In order to get to that, though, we first have to deal with the setting, and what exactly the machine is doing. While it isn't stated outright in too much detail, the brain of the patient, in this case John, is directly connected to the device. Using a mix of the patient's brain and the machine's inner computer, a sort of hybrid dreamscape simulation is created, where the doctors can then connect to and modify it via the computer on their end, but the memories and thoughts and feelings of the patient are still deeply involved with everything they're doing. The machine, for lack of a better word, tries to bring the patient back to the past. It tries to visually depict the events that happened to them in front of them, and then use that as a way to remind them of events that happened even earlier in their life. And then doing this over and over, going step by step by step, as far back through his lifespan as they can, the goal is to eventually have a very solid understanding of an early memory that they can then use as a launching off point to recreate the entire life going forward. So, like, if you wanted to remind an old man of what life was like in high school, you would remind him of what life was like in his 50s, and then use those memories to try and jog memories of his 40s, and then those memories to jog memories of his 30s, and so on, like, step by step, reminding him of further and further events in the past. One important aspect that needs to be mentioned here is that anything that affects the physical health of the patient in the present day, because the machine is directly attached to his brain, will affect the simulated world inside it, and that this can potentially hurt the doctors if they're trapped inside it when he has, say, a heart attack or something. Sigmund Corp, the organization our two doctors work for, grants the wishes of its clientele by implanting in their younger selves the desire to accomplish their dying wish. From there, the machine, using a wiki of data combined with the memories and the subconscious and mind of the patient, then recreates and does a rerun of their entire life, simulating what would have happened if their entire life was dedicated to, in this case, going to the moon. While I think all of this works, it does raise a couple questions that are never fully addressed. First off, you run into the ship of Theseus issue. Assuming nurture theory of humanity, where people are made by the events that happen to them over the course of their lives, there's a strong case that the John who goes to the moon with River isn't the exact same John as the one who made the wish. And given the step-by-step story of their life is shown in-game, it strongly feels like the nurture theory is kinda what the game is going with. The fact his modern-day subconscious is involved in creating it does add a layer of legitimacy to it, but it is still kind of a philosophically open question, for lack of a better word. Beyond that, what if the wish is physically impossible, like I want to become Superman? Or if it's technically doable, but not feasibly achievable, like someone wanting to become a pro basketball player, but they're 4 foot tall. If someone always wanted to be a professional singer, but they never had the confidence to get on stage, then transferring the desire doesn't actually do anything meaningfully to help grant their wish. And if they always wanted to be a professional athlete, then without hard work and the willingness to hit the gym, they're never going to get there anyway. In both cases, the desire isn't the issue, it's other personality traits regarding their ability to achieve their dreams, and if the machine is changing that, then it's getting into more mind control territory, which comes with a whole different set of implications to it. Furthermore, and while this is very dark for To the Moon specifically, it is worth mentioning that in any setting where you're having a simulation that is directly attached to someone's mind and their perception of reality, any sort of glitch is a huge concern. If he gets stuck in the memory of his brother dying and it just loops over and over, or if there's a factory reset in the machine and it just deletes everything, including the memories that it's hooked up to, the implications of there being any sort of glitch in this system are incredibly dark, especially since it has the capability of rewriting an entire lifetime's worth of memories and experiences. Finally, the true death and living with trauma ideas feel important to bring up. If you're working from the assumption that people who die functionally live on through the legacy they leave behind, that the memory of them does allow them to continue influencing the world after their death, then in a very real, literal sense, River is dying a second time if John forgets her. Similarly, if you buy into the idea that burying trauma and unpleasant memories is not a good thing, that you should try and confront the things that have hurt you in the past, then the entire main quest of the game being helping him forget it is kind of icky and weird by normal logic. We're kind of used to films like Coraline, where it's unambiguously a bad thing, so it's just kind of a weird idea across the board to wrap your mind around. I do think To the Moon sidesteps most of these philosophical issues through the sheer fact that John is dying. He won't be getting much use of the memories he's gained over the years and the wisdom that he's gotten from them, and the memory of River is going to be dying with him anyway. While not every issue is resolved, the basic fact is that giving a dying man a bit of happiness on his way out is generally fine. It's allowing him the delusion of being with his wife again just once, and preventing that is taking away happiness for no reason. The Emperor's New Clothes operates the same way it always does, with the Emperor being offered clothes that are invisible to fools, but visible to everyone else. Most lie and claim to see it for the sake of their reputation, but during a parade, a child asks why the Emperor is naked. Everyone realizes at the same time that the Emperor has been tricked thanks to the child. In spite of the embarrassment, the Emperor chooses to march onwards anyway, since the damage was already done and he might as well save face. After all, it's not like he can just turn back at that point, and if he's really lucky, maybe the clothes do exist after all. While you can interpret it as just being a story about perseverance and just trying to tough through and make do with a bad situation, since eventually everything will be alright, it can also be read as a message about intentionally and willingly indulging in fantasy. That even if he knows the clothes are not real, it would be less embarrassing for him to just pretend the rest of the way, and that there is merit in him doing so, even if it's a lie. The library conversation between River and John, where River says that children's media is still comforting, ties into this. The idea that comfort from media is an end unto itself, that even if it isn't functional or mature, that it still has value if it gives you joy, that idea is very important here, and it's kind of the thing I love about To the Moon. River's life and memories live on not just through John, but also in Watson Rosalind because of his decision to engage in fantasy at the end, to buy the fake clothes they're selling. The message of To the Moon, the thing that makes it stand out among all the games I've played and books I've read, movies I've watched, songs I've listened to, is just that engaging in fantasy, even if it isn't intellectually stimulating, if it doesn't feel productive, is an end unto itself, that the joy you get and the mental health care it provides is still 1000% worth it. Not that many stories explore this idea, and that is why I love To the Moon. And that's the vid. Thank you for watching. If you have any suggestions on things that I can improve, then please give, and yeah, just thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.